Your voice is not an accident. It is not simply vibration through air or sound waves bouncing off walls. Your voice is the most sacred technology you possess. The divine instrument through which worlds are built and realities are commanded. Yet most of you whisper when you should thunder. Most of you beg when you should decree. Most of you describe your prison when you should be commanding your freedom. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, for it will shatter every lie you have believed about powerlessness. The same force that spoke light into existence, that commanded waters to part, that declared mountains to move, that very same creative power flows through your vocal cords right now. But you have been taught to minimize it, to doubt it, to use it only for casual conversation, when it was designed for cosmic construction. There is a spiritual law written into the fabric of existence itself. Nothing manifests in the physical realm without first being spoken in the spiritual realm. Nothing. Not healing, not wealth, not love, not breakthrough, not restoration. The word always precedes the manifestation. The decree always comes before the delivery. And your tongue, whether you realize it or not, is constantly writing the script of your tomorrow. But here is what most miss. You think your thoughts create your reality. You believe your emotions shape your world. You imagine your actions alone determine your outcomes. But Scripture reveals a deeper truth. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Proverbs 18:21. Your tongue is the pen that writes your destiny. Your voice is the architect that designs your experience. So I ask you now with holy urgency, what have you been speaking? What blueprint have your words been drawing? What structure has your voice been commanding into existence? Because whether you speak consciously or carelessly, whether you declare intentionally or accidentally, your tongue is always building something. The question is, are you building the life you desire or the life you dread? Too many of you have become experts at describing your problems. You can articulate every detail of your struggle, every nuance of your pain, every dimension of your delay. You speak fluently about what is wrong, what is missing, what is not working. But when was the last time you spoke with equal passion about what must be right? When did you last describe your breakthrough with the same detail you used to describe your breakdown? The law does not respond to your pain. The law responds to your proclamation. Heaven is not moved by your problem. Heaven is activated by your pronouncement. You can cry for 1,000 years about what you lack, but until you command what you claim, nothing shifts. Until you speak with the authority of one who knows their inheritance, you will keep inheriting what you have always had. I have watched souls suffer in silence, calling it spirituality. I have seen believers bite their tongues, calling it submission. I have witnessed warriors whisper their victories, calling it humility. But this is not holy behavior. This is spiritual paralysis. This is divine muteness. And it keeps you bound not by the enemy, but by your own echo of defeat. Your silence in the face of lack is agreement with lack. Your quietness in the presence of sickness is partnership with sickness. Your muteness when confronted with delay is a contract with delay. Every moment you do not speak against what opposes you, you speak for it. Every second you remain silent about your breakthrough, you extend your breakdown. But today this changes. Today you remember what your voice was created to do. Today you stop describing your condition and start commanding your transformation. Today you break the cycle of vocal weakness and step into the rhythm of spoken strength. Understand this clearly: God does not speak from need. God speaks from authority. God does not beg creation to obey. God commands it. And you, made in the image of the Most High, carry that same creative frequency in your vocal cords. When you align your speech with divine truth, when you echo heaven's declarations, when you speak as God speaks, reality has no choice but to rearrange itself around your words. This is not positive thinking. This is not wishful speaking. This is spiritual law in action. This is the same principle that framed the worlds, that separated light from darkness, that called forth dry land from the waters. Your voice, when yielded to divine authority, becomes an instrument of creation, a tool of transformation, a weapon of warfare against every force that would oppose your destiny. But you must learn to speak like heaven speaks. You must train your tongue to echo eternity. You must discipline your declarations to align with divine truth rather than human appearance. This requires courage. This demands faith. This necessitates a complete revolution in how you use the most powerful instrument you possess. The enemy knows the power of your voice. That is why he works overtime to keep you silent, discouraged, afraid to speak boldly. He understands that a believer with a commanding voice is a force he cannot contain. He knows that when you learn to decree rather than plead, to declare rather than doubt, to command rather than complain, his schemes crumble and his strongholds fall. So he whispers lies about your authority. He tells you that bold speech is presumptuous. He convinces you that commanding prayer is arrogant. He deceives you into thinking that humble whispers are more spiritual than holy declarations. But these are strategies designed to keep your most powerful weapon sheathed, your greatest tool unused, your divine inheritance unclaimed. Today you unsheathe the sword of your speech. Today you unleash the weapon of your words. Today you step into the full authority of your voice and begin to speak your world into the shape it was always meant to take. Your voice carries the DNA of dominion. Every word you speak either builds or breaks, creates or destroys, opens or closes, advances or retreats. There is no neutral speech. There are no powerless words, even silence speaks, even quiet declarations. Even unspoken thoughts eventually find their way to your tongue and shape your world. This is why the quality of your vocabulary determines the quality of your experience. This is why the nature of your narrative creates the nature of your life. This is why the substance of your speech becomes the substance of your reality. You are not a victim of circumstances. You are the author of them through the instrument of your voice. But most have been trained to speak from appearance rather than from authority. You look at your bank account and speak poverty. You feel the symptoms and speak sickness. You see the empty space and speak loneliness. You observe the closed doors and speak rejection. But this is backwards thinking. This is inverted creation. This is why your life reflects what you see rather than what you seek. Divine creation works in reverse. You speak first, then you see. You declare first, then you experience. You call those things that are not as though they were, and they become. This is not denial of reality. This is the creation of new reality. This is not ignoring what is. This is commanding what must be. When you speak healing while still feeling sick, you are not lying. You are prophesying. When you declare abundance while still seeing lack, you are not pretending. You are creating. When you command breakthrough while still experiencing delay, you are not fantasizing. You are legislating. Your tongue is the legislative branch of your personal government. Whatever laws you pass with your mouth become the constitution of your experience. Whatever you consistently speak becomes the legislation by which your life operates. Whatever you repeatedly declare becomes the legal framework within which your reality must function. So what laws have you been passing? What legislation has your tongue been enacting? What constitutional amendments have your words been writing into the fabric of your existence? Because every casual complaint is a law passed against your prosperity. Every habitual expression of doubt is legislation that limits your possibilities. Every repeated confession of defeat is a constitutional amendment that restricts your victories. But here is the beauty of this revelation. You can repeal every law you have passed against yourself. You can overturn every negative legislation. You can amend every limiting constitution. The same tongue that created your problems can command your solutions. The same voice that built your prison can construct your palace. This requires what I call vocal violence against everything that opposes your divine inheritance. You must aggressively speak against every spirit of lack, every force of fear, every demon of delay. You must violently declare the truth about who you are and what belongs to you. You must brutally command every contrary circumstance to align with heaven's blueprint for your life. This is not about volume. This is about authority. This is not about shouting. This is about certainty. This is not about emotional intensity. This is about spiritual clarity. When you know who you are and what you carry, your voice naturally carries the weight of that knowing. I want you to imagine your voice as a sword. Not a decoration, not an ornament, but a weapon forged in the fires of divine authority and sharpened by the truth of God's word. Every time you speak in alignment with heaven's declarations about you, you swing that sword against the forces of darkness. Every time you decree divine truth over human appearance, you cut through the lies that have bound you. But a sword in its sheath does no damage. A weapon that is never drawn provides no protection. An instrument that is never played produces no music. Your voice, no matter how powerful, cannot change anything if it remains silent. Your declarations, no matter how true, cannot transform anything if they remain unspoken. The time for silent suffering is over. The season of quiet desperation has ended. The era of voiceless victory is finished. Today you learn to use your voice as heaven intended, as an instrument of divine authority, as a weapon of spiritual warfare, as a tool of miraculous manifestation. Your breakthrough is not coming from heaven. Your breakthrough is coming through your voice. Your miracle is not descending from the clouds. Your miracle is ascending from your declarations. Your victory is not arriving on angel wings. Your victory is emerging from your vocal cords. Stop waiting for God to do what God has already empowered you to do. Stop praying for heaven to move what heaven has given you authority to command. Stop asking for divine intervention when you have been equipped with divine authority. The intervention you seek is in your voice. The power you need is in your proclamation. The miracle you desire is in your declaration. But you must learn to speak like you believe what you are saying. You must declare like you know it is already done. You must command like you expect immediate obedience. Half-hearted declarations produce half-hearted results. Tentative proclamations create tentative manifestations. Uncertain commands generate uncertain outcomes. The universe responds to the certainty of your conviction, not the desperation of your need. Heaven answers the confidence of your declarations, not the intensity of your emotions. Reality reshapes itself around the authority of your speech, not the volume of your voice. This means you must develop what I call prophetic arrogance. The holy boldness to speak what heaven has already decreed, even when earth has not yet demonstrated it. This is the audacity to call yourself healed when the symptoms persist. This is the courage to declare yourself wealthy when the bills are due. This is the faith to command breakthrough when everything appears blocked. This is not presumption. This is obedience to divine law. This is not pride. This is alignment with heaven's perspective. This is not delusion. This is dominion exercised through the most powerful tool you possess, your voice. When Jesus spoke to the storm, he did not analyze the weather patterns. He did not discuss the atmospheric conditions. He did not debate the meteorological factors. He simply commanded, "Peace, be still." And the storm obeyed. Why? Because his voice carried the authority of heaven, and heaven's authority supersedes natural law. Your voice, when aligned with divine truth, carries that same authority. Your declarations, when rooted in God's word, possess that same power. Your commands, when issued from a position of spiritual knowing, generate that same obedience. But you must learn to speak to your circumstances, not just about them. You must address your situations directly, not just describe them to others. You must command your conditions to change, not just comment on how they appear. Speak to your finances, money. You will flow into my life in abundance. Resources, you will come to me from expected and unexpected sources. Wealth, you will manifest in my experience according to divine law. Speak to your health, body, you will function in perfect harmony. Cells, you will operate according to divine design. Every organ, every system, you will work in complete wholeness and strength. Speak to your relationships. Love, you will find me and I will recognize you. The right connections will gravitate toward me. Divine relationships will manifest in my life at the perfect time. Speak to your calling. Purpose, you will unfold clearly before me. Opportunities will open in divine sequence. My gifts will find their proper expression and compensation. This is not talking to yourself. This is commanding your world. This is not wishful thinking. This is spiritual legislation. This is not fantasy. This is the exercise of divine authority through the instrument of human speech. Your voice is the bridge between the spiritual and physical realms. Your words are the vehicles that transport heaven's realities into earth's experience. Your declarations are the construction equipment that builds divine blueprints in natural dimensions. But this requires consistency. One declaration does not create lasting change. One command does not establish permanent transformation. One decree does not build eternal structure. You must develop what I call vocal consistency. The discipline to speak your truth daily, to declare your reality repeatedly, to command your circumstances continuously. Make your voice a constant broadcaster of divine truth. Let your tongue become a 24-hour station that plays nothing but heaven's soundtrack over your life. Allow your declarations to create an atmosphere of expectation that attracts the manifestation of what you consistently speak. This is not about perfection. This is about persistence. This is not about never doubting. This is about always declaring. This is not about feeling ready. This is about speaking truth regardless of how you feel. Your emotions will catch up to your declarations. Your feelings will align with your confessions. Your experience will conform to your consistent speech. But you must lead with your voice, not follow with your feelings. There will be moments when your circumstances seem to mock your declarations. There will be times when your situation appears to contradict your confessions. There will be seasons when reality seems to resist your commands. But this is when your voice must become even stronger, your declarations more frequent, your commands more certain. The resistance you feel is not proof that your voice lacks power. The opposition you encounter is evidence that your words are creating disruption in the spiritual realm. The challenges that arise are signs that your declarations are threatening the status quo and forcing change. Do not let temporary appearances silence your eternal voice. Do not allow momentary setbacks to mute your prophetic tongue. Do not permit passing problems to permanently quiet your commanding speech. Your voice is your victory weapon. Your tongue is your transformation tool. Your words are your warfare equipment. Use them with the same intensity that warriors use their swords. With the same precision that surgeons use their instruments. With the same confidence that commanders use their authority. The kingdom of heaven is not coming to you through your circumstances. The kingdom of heaven is coming through your voice. Divine reality is not imposed upon you from external sources. Divine reality is expressed through you via your vocal declarations. You are not waiting for your breakthrough. Your breakthrough is waiting for your voice. You are not hoping for your miracle. Your miracle is hanging on your words. You are not praying for your victory. Your victory is programmed into your declarations. Now let me tell you about the anatomy of commanding speech. There are levels to vocal authority, depths to declarative power, dimensions to commanding presence. Most believers speak from the surface. using their voice as a casual tool rather than a sacred weapon. But I am calling you to speak from the depths, to access the profound power that lies dormant in your vocal cords. The first level is descriptive speech. This is where most live. You describe what you see, report what you feel, narrate what you experience. This level of speech makes you a victim of circumstances, because you are merely echoing what already exists. Your voice becomes a mirror that reflects reality, rather than a hammer that shapes it. The second level is hopeful speech. Here you express desires, share dreams, voice aspirations. This is better than descriptive speech, but it still lacks authority. Hope is not command. Wishing is not decreeing. Wanting is not claiming. Many believers get stuck at this level, forever hoping but never possessing. The third level is faith speech. This is where you begin to speak contrary to circumstances, where you declare what you believe rather than what you see. This level has power, but it can waver. Faith speech depends on feeling, on confidence, on internal certainty. When doubt comes, faith speech often falters. But there is a fourth level. And this is where I am calling you to operate. This is commanding speech. At this level, you speak not from feeling but from knowing. Not from hope but from authority. Not from faith but from dominion. Commanding speech does not depend on your emotions, your circumstances, or even your faith. It depends only on your understanding of who you are, and what power you carry. When you speak from the commanding level, you are not asking the universe to cooperate. You are instructing it to comply. You are not requesting divine intervention. You are exercising divine authority. You are not hoping for change. You are mandating transformation. This level of speech requires what I call spiritual violence. Not physical aggression, but a holy assault on every force that would oppose your inheritance. You must violently evict every spirit of lack from your atmosphere. You must aggressively command every demon of delay to flee your timeline. You must brutally declare war on every stronghold that has established itself in your experience. This is the speech that Jesus used when he cleared the temple. He did not politely ask the money changers to leave. He violently overturned their tables and commanded them out. This is the speech that Moses used when he stretched his rod over the Red Sea. He did not hope the waters would part. He commanded them to divide. This is the speech that Joshua used when he told the sun to stand still. He did not request a longer day. He decreed it. Your voice carries this same commanding authority. Your tongue possesses this same violent power. Your words contain this same transformational force. But you must learn to access these deeper levels of vocal authority. Practice speaking to your mirror every morning. Look yourself in the eye and command your day to align with divine purpose. Speak to your reflection and decree breakthrough in every area of your life. Address the person you see and declare victory over every challenge you will face. Practice speaking to your circumstances. Do not just think about your problems. Talk to them directly. Command your financial lack to be broken. Instruct your physical symptoms to cease. Order your relational conflicts to be resolved. Demand your professional obstacles to be removed. Practice speaking to your future. Do not just hope for better days. Command them to manifest. Do not just dream of breakthrough. Decree its arrival. Do not just wish for change. Legislate transformation through the authority of your voice, but understand this commanding speech is not loud speech. Authority is not volume. Power is not noise. Some of the most commanding voices speak in quiet tones. Some of the most authoritative declarations are made in whispers. Some of the most powerful commands are issued in calm certainty. The power is not in how loud you speak. The power is in how sure you are of what you speak. The authority is not in your vocal intensity. The authority is in your spiritual certainty. The force is not in your emotional expression. The force is in your divine conviction. When you know who you are, your voice carries weight regardless of its volume. When you understand your authority, your words carry power regardless of their tone. When you recognize your dominion, your declarations carry force regardless of their delivery. I have seen broken down believers whisper one certain word and watch mountains move. I have witnessed quiet saints speak one authoritative declaration and see strongholds crumble. I have observed humble servants issue one commanding decree and watch hell itself retreat. The key is not in the sound of your voice. The key is in the source of your voice. When you speak from your divine nature, rather than your human nature, your voice carries heaven's authority. When you declare from your spiritual identity, rather than your natural identity, your words possess supernatural power. This is why you must know who you are before you can command what you want. This is why you must understand your identity before you can exercise your authority. This is why you must recognize your position before you can demonstrate your power. You are not just a human being trying to get God's attention. You are a divine being expressing God's nature. You are not just a creation asking for help. You are a co-creator exercising authority. You are not just a servant hoping for blessing. You are a son or daughter claiming inheritance. When you speak from this place of knowing, your voice automatically carries authority. When you declare from this position of understanding, your words naturally possess power. When you command from this platform of identity, your speech inevitably produces results. But many believers have been taught to diminish their identity in the name of humility. They have been conditioned to minimize their authority in the name of submission. They have been trained to weaken their voice in the name of reverence. But this is not biblical humility. This is spiritual amnesia. True humility is not thinking less of yourself. True humility is not thinking of yourself less. True humility is thinking of yourself accurately, and the accurate assessment of your identity, according to Scripture, is that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, created in God's image, endowed with divine authority, equipped with supernatural power. When you understand this truth, your voice changes. When you embrace this identity, your speech transforms. When you accept this reality, your declarations carry weight that shakes both heaven and earth. Let me share with you the science of vocal manifestation. There are frequencies that create and frequencies that destroy. There are vibrations that build and vibrations that break down. There are sound waves that heal and sound waves that harm. Your voice, when properly calibrated, becomes a frequency generator that produces specific outcomes in your experience. When you speak words of lack, you generate frequencies of poverty. When you declare phrases of sickness, you create vibrations of disease. When you voice expressions of fear, you produce sound waves of anxiety. Your vocal cords are not just producing noise. They are generating energy patterns that shape your reality. But when you learn to speak words of abundance, you generate frequencies of prosperity. When you declare phrases of health, you create vibrations of healing. When you voice expressions of faith, you produce sound waves of peace. Your voice becomes a tuning fork that calibrates your entire experience to match the frequency of your words. This is not mysticism. This is physics. This is not superstition. This is science. Sound creates form, frequency shapes reality, vibration determines structure. Your voice is a powerful instrument that literally creates the world you inhabit through the frequencies it generates. But most people use their voice carelessly, generating random frequencies that produce chaotic results. They speak without thought, declare without intention, command without understanding. Their vocal output becomes a mixture of creative and destructive frequencies that cancel each other out and produce mediocre results. You must learn to use your voice with precision, generating specific frequencies that produce desired outcomes. You must speak with intention, declare with purpose, command with understanding. Your vocal output must become a focused beam of creative energy that shapes reality according to your conscious design. This requires what I call frequency discipline. You must monitor the energy patterns you generate with your speech. You must calibrate your vocal output to match the reality you desire to create. You must tune your voice to resonate with the frequencies of your divine inheritance. Practice speaking words that generate abundance frequencies: prosperity, wealth, increase, overflow, provision, blessing, favor, success, breakthrough, expansion. Practice declaring phrases that create healing frequencies: wholeness, strength, vitality, health, restoration, renewal, regeneration, recovery, wellness, soundness. Practice commanding expressions that produce peace frequencies: calm, stillness, serenity, tranquility, harmony, balance, order, rest, stability, security. As you consistently generate these positive frequencies through your speech, your entire energy field begins to resonate with these patterns. Your aura becomes a magnet for experiences that match these vibrations. Your presence creates an atmosphere that attracts manifestations aligned with these frequencies. But you must be consistent. One day of positive speech, followed by a week of negative speech, creates frequency confusion. 1 hour of commanding declarations followed by hours of complaining creates vibrational chaos. You must maintain frequency discipline to see lasting results. Make your voice a constant generator of creative frequencies. Let your speech become a perpetual producer of positive vibrations. Allow your declarations to create a sustained energy field that consistently attracts the reality you desire. The ancient Hebrew understanding of speech was that words were living entities with their own consciousness and power. When you spoke a word, you were not just making noise. You were releasing a living force into the atmosphere that would work to accomplish the purpose for which it was sent. This is why Isaiah 55:11 declares, "So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please. And it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it." Your words are not just sounds that fade away. Your declarations are not just expressions that disappear. Your commands are not just statements that dissolve. Every word you speak is a living force that goes forth to accomplish the purpose embedded within it. When you speak words of healing, you release healing forces into your atmosphere. When you declare words of prosperity, you send forth prospering agents into your experience. When you command words of breakthrough, you dispatch breakthrough energies into your circumstances. But the reverse is also true. When you speak words of sickness, you release sickness forces into your environment. When you declare words of poverty, you send forth impoverishing agents into your life. When you command words of failure, you dispatch failing energies into your situation. This is why you must become extremely selective about the words you allow to pass through your lips. This is why you must develop what I call vocabulary vigilance. Every word you speak either works for you or against you. Every declaration either builds your desired reality or strengthens your unwanted circumstances. You cannot afford to speak carelessly. You cannot permit yourself to declare randomly. You cannot allow your tongue to command thoughtlessly. Your voice is too powerful, your words too creative, your speech too influential to be used without conscious intention. Begin to see your tongue as a sacred trust. View your voice as a holy responsibility. Understand your speech as a divine stewardship. You have been given the most powerful creative tool in existence. How you use it determines not only your own destiny, but impacts everyone within the range of your influence. Your children hear your declarations, and their subconscious minds record your words as truth. Your spouse absorbs your confessions, and their internal reality adjusts to match your speech. Your friends receive your proclamations, and their belief systems align with your expressions. You are not just creating your own reality with your words. You are influencing the reality of everyone around you. Your voice is not just shaping your own experience. Your speech is affecting the experiences of all who hear you. This is an awesome responsibility and a tremendous opportunity. You can speak life into your family through your declarations. You can create prosperity for your community through your confessions. You can generate breakthrough for your generation through your commands. But you must rise to this level of vocal responsibility. You must embrace this standard of speech accountability. You must accept this dimension of declarative stewardship. The time for casual conversation is over. The era of thoughtless talk has ended. The season of random rhetoric is finished. You now understand the power of your voice, the authority of your words, the responsibility of your speech. From this moment forward, every word you speak must be intentional. Every declaration you make must be purposeful. Every command you issue must be strategic. Your tongue has been conscripted into the service of transformation. Your voice has been commissioned as an agent of manifestation. You are no longer just a person who talks. You are a frequency generator, a reality creator, a world shaper. Your voice is your instrument of dominion, your tool of transformation, your weapon of warfare. Use it wisely. Use it powerfully. Use it with the full understanding that you hold in your mouth the keys to your destiny, the codes to your breakthrough, the passwords to your promised land. Your commanding voice is awakening. Your authoritative speech is activating. Your transformational words are manifesting. The universe is listening. Heaven is responding. Reality is reshaping itself around your declarations. Speak your breakthrough. Declare your victory. Command your transformation. Your voice is your divine instrument. Use it now. Use it powerfully. Use it with the certainty that every word spoken in faith becomes flesh in your experience. The commanding voice within you is ready. The creative authority in your speech is primed. The manifestational power of your words is activated. Everything you need is waiting for you to speak it into existence. Your time of silence is over. Your season of weakness has ended. Your era of powerless speech is finished. You now possess the knowledge, the understanding, the revelation of your vocal authority. Go forth and speak worlds into existence. Declare realities into manifestation. Command circumstances into alignment. Your voice is your victory. Your words are your weapons. Your speech is your solution. The commanding voice is yours. The creative authority is activated. The transformational power is released. Speak, and watch your world transform according to the words of your mouth. And so it is.